Good evening, everybody. It's Tuesday, October 27, and we're going live. It's Tuesday night podcast. And, as usual, every second Tuesday, we have our special guest, Benjamin Casteillo, all the way from France. He comes in and we talk about the new world together.
Oh, yeah. Hi, Stuart. Hi, everyone.
How are you? Are you well?
I am good.
How was your week?
My week is tough.
I think most people's week was tough.
I don't know about others, but mine was challenging, at least.
How was the challenge?
For me, it's more, at this stage, it's an internal challenge. I'm facing parts of myself and some disconnection from myself, and so there's a lot of frustration that's coming out of it. And yeah, that's part of the work that I'm doing. That's why. That's
internal work.
Which is part of what needs to be done if we want to see change in the world. We will not have change in the world if we don't know how to change ourselves. So any other change must start with an inner change.
And that's some kind of doubts in the process that haunt you or something?
Well, doubts are part of the process, of course. I think what I will call it is shadow work. It's a reintegrating part of ourselves that we didn't wanted to see before, or that we were not ready to see before, and everything that they represent, every repressed emotion that goes with them. And so that's a process of becoming whole, but that take place with moments of discomfort and doubt.
Yeah. And when do you get your doubts exactly? Just to continue this for a small moment.
Oh, okay.
Is this in the middle of the night? Do you wake up and sort of think, "Oh my God, what am I doing?"
No, not at all. I think it's just there's a moment where as these parts of ourselves are being reintegrated, doubts is slowly being replaced by clarity, and then we generally get better. We feel more whole, more complete afterward. But the process is a process that can be uncomfortable and disturbing. Yeah. And I'm quite used to it, so I'm not really like this. This one is just obviously it's obviously a big transition that I'm going through. So I've had big transitions before and smaller transitions, and I'm just the best way to go through this is accepting that this is part of a process and that negative emotions and disturbing thoughts can come out of it, and that as a result a certain level of confusion and doubts are also part of it.
Well, tonight's subject is because what we do, we're talking about the big picture and how to think globally and make sense of our world's biggest challenges. And tonight's topic is human nature. Is human nature too evil and self-destructive?
Yeah, that's what we are going to explore.
And so where do we begin?
Well, I think we can begin about human nature in the first place and some of the dominant beliefs that we tend to have around it. So, because there are so many angles to bring that, so let me see what one way to look at it is to first observe that human nature is evolutive, that it change.
Evolutional. Is that the word?
Evolutional. Okay, sorry. Evolutional. And that it change based on times and context. And so to go there, one way to look at it is simply looking at the theory of evolution and how before we've been Homo sapiens, we've been Neanderthals and back to monkeys and reptilians, etc. And we can go to the origin of life. So what I want to say there is...
It's like where it all began.
Well, it all began with, for me, it all began with the creation of the universe, so what we call the Big Bang. And then there's an expansion, and then there's an evolution, and the creation of our planet. Then on our planet, the creation of life as we know it, and an evolution of life. And from that, around 150,000 years ago, is estimated to be the beginning of Homo sapiens, which has the particularity to have advanced ability to think and to create concepts out of his thinking. Of course, this is a slow process of evolution at first compared to what we see now. So most of Homo sapiens' existence has been spent as hunter-gatherers. Finally, the period in which we settle in a certain place is quite new. It's estimated to be about 10,000, 12,000 years ago. And so most of our existence, we've really been spent completely free, or if you want, as nomads. And there's been another period, another context that is called the Anthropocene that started an estimated 250 years ago. That saw Homo sapiens.
Was that 250 years ago?
It's estimated to be 250 years ago. There's different ways to look at it, different perspective, but that's the one that I choose to have because it makes the best sense for me.
Explain to us what Anthropocene.
So the Anthropocene is the era that sees Homo sapiens or humanity dominate the surface of the globe. So what marks the entrance in the Anthropocene is the beginning of the Industrial Revolution in Europe, in the US. And what we see is that we completely develop the ability to dominate our natural environment, manifest abundance, and as a result, having more individual freedom.
Moving to the city.
Moving to
creating
the city,
cities.
Yeah, starting to create big cities because we already had cities before. But especially, I think what makes a difference is really this stage where, the natural environment, we really start to dominate it. Again, I'm going to repeat, but we start to create abundance and we start to be more free to be ourselves. And I will explain why this represents a major change and why it makes a big difference. Before the Anthropocene, our ancestors were the priority of life is survival, because without survival there is no life, right? So the first basic instinct is about survival. So before the Anthropocene, basically, what our ancestors had to do was to survive in an hostile environment in which scarcity was the norm, deprivation was the norm, and in which there was a need to stick together in order to survive. There was a need. Homo sapiens is not a hunter that hunt by himself. We hunt as a pack. We survive
tribal.
As a group. We are tribal. We are social animals. And so one of the fundamental of survival is fear. I want to highlight that because very often we consider that fear is bad and that we shouldn't fear, but fear is necessary to survive, which means that our ancestors who basically did best at survival are the ones who learned to fear the right danger. And if we look at the condition to which our ancestors have evolved before the Anthropocene, there was three major fears that were necessary. There was the fear of hostility. That's because the environment was hostile. So hostility from animal predators at an early age, but later of hostilities from other sapiens, other tribes, or hostility from illnesses, basically, but anything that is linked with our physical integrity. So we've learned to fear hostility from different sources. We've learned to fear scarcity because our ancestors were living in condition of deprivation. They didn't have the means to create the abundance that we have today. And then the third big danger was the danger of finding ourselves isolated, unable to benefit from the protection of the tribe, unable to reproduce. So that goes with the fear of separation. And so what we see is that how our intelligence has been oriented to respond to this fear. So how do we respond to the fear of hostility? By learning how to dominate our environment. How do we respond to the fear of scarcity? By learning to accumulate resources. How do we respond to the fear of separation? By learning to fit in. So those for our ancestors were three fundamental needs: the need to dominate our environment, the need to accumulate resources, the need to fit in the group. And so the intelligence has been focused on that, and this was very valid until we enter this new era, which is the Anthropocene. Because suddenly in the Anthropocene, the environment is not anymore a danger. We already dominate it. Scarcity is not anymore a condition. We are already able to manifest abundance. Fearing rejection of the group is not as needed anymore, because we have more ability and conditions to be truly ourselves. Except that our whole survival instinct is not prepared for domination of the natural environment, for abundance, and for being truly ourselves, having this ability to express who we truly are. And so we've moved in the Anthropocene, but with the survival instinct of the pre-Anthropocene era, which has been shaped during hundreds of thousands of years of evolution. And so that creates a problem that is, from what we see, a key factor of unsustainability, if not the root cause of unsustainability.
Which part?
All of them. So I'm gonna take all of them separately and explain why. So, for example, if we take the fear of hostility, so as a result, with our survival instinct makes us strive to dominate our environment, but we thrived against each other because we all want full control, but we don't know how to share it, and so we are perpetuating rivalry dynamic. Now the problem is that we have rivalry dynamic with exponential technological progress and therefore destructive power. That by itself is self-terminating.
But that's coming from the way we're conditioned over many years too.
Yes, that's coming from hundreds of thousands of years of conditioning, deeply embedded in our survival instinct and in our unconscious. So we are now talking about the fear of hostility and the rivalry dynamics, but the same thing will happen with resources. So if we are unconsciously accumulating resources because we fear not having enough, then we end up over-consuming the resources. Then we end up fearing not having enough because we realize that we are over-consuming. And so we become trapped in a vicious circle. That by itself is self-terminating as well.
What's the vicious circle? Eating too much?
No, eating too much is one problem in the West, and particularly in the US. But no, it's just never having enough and always striving for more. So we see that a lot. For example, corporations are entities that work in that principle. It's this competition for growth and accumulation of short-term profits, capital, and that on a finite planet is by itself not sustainable. It turns basically human beings as a cancer on the surface of the globe. But what we see behind it is this inherited fear of not having enough, because we've spent most of our existence as sapiens dealing with scarcity. And of course, the problem is that as we are competing for resources, then we do not have a proper repartition of resources, and therefore some people end up being in scarcity. That by itself, in our reality, perpetuates the fear of not having enough.
Well, there's still millions of people under the line of poverty, right?
Yes, of course. And this is probably the conversation we're having before, with the wealth repartition, when we have the 1% wealthiest part of the world population, which accumulates about 50% of the global wealth, and the 70% poorest, less than 3% of it. But what we see behind is that there's this drive to accumulate always more, because our survival instinct has taught us that this was the way to survive. And that perpetuates the idea that there's not enough for everyone. So again, on a finite planet with limited resources, this by itself is self-terminating. Then the last one is the fear of separation. That results in behaviors of conformist behaviors that tend to perpetuate the status quo. Now, when the status quo is dysfunctional and unsustainable, that is also part of the problem.
Because nobody stands up?
Nobody stands up by fear of being rejected. So to give you an idea about this one, so during the online program that we did, so participants were invited to talk about their deepest fear and why it is so hard for them to speak about this very disturbing subject. And all of them came to the fear of being alone, the fear of being rejected. So that's deeply embedded in us. It's easy to understand. I mean, the ancestor that did not know how to fit in within the norm did not make it. They were rejected, they were executed, they did not make it. Those who made it are those who learn to fit in. So right now, what is really interesting is that the situation in which we are obliges us to consciously confront our survival instinct in order to be able to survive as a species. And so it's a call for consciousness.
The fear of dying would be amongst that, wouldn't it?
Yes, and that's really about, it's about realizing that if we collectively perpetuate this primitive survival instinct, it is going to self-terminate us. We are all going to die. So interestingly, in order to survive and to not die, it's all connected. We are invited to transcend this primitive survival instinct that we have inherited and that has completely shaped our society.
But there's still people, say, I'd imagine in Africa or somewhere, they still are trying to survive.
Of course, and that needs to be taken in consideration. And
even in the United States, probably, where there's
everywhere,
when people don't have money to live.
Okay, so let me highlight that, because indeed we need first to understand that we are kept in a vicious cycle. So I'm gonna just highlight another vicious cycle is the one based on the fear of hostility, right? So if we are driven by the fear of hostility, then the response to that is that we need control and power. And therefore, we end up all being in rivalry dynamics for control and power, which create hostility, which perpetuate the fear of hostility. So the danger is there, but we don't realize that we are now the creator of our own danger. It is not anymore something natural. It is something that we perpetuate out of unconsciousness. But
we also have government.
Okay, great.
Where,
So that's we are going. It's funny because we are going to cover all the the parts. Points. It comes naturally. So we're going to connect the dots here. So of course, what we have to understand is that our society and its fundamentals have been shaped by our ancestors in order to allow us to survive. Based on this step by step, and not consciously, unconsciously, right? So if we look at governments, yes, they are pillar of, they are driver of some pillars of our society, drivers to some extent, because the power of government is limited. But let's not go into that. So governments drives theoretically nations. If we look at nations, it is the most advanced tribal entity that we've come up with. The purpose of a nation is to respond to the fear of hostility from the outer world, with boundaries, with armies, and military power, right? And
connectivity.
And
being connected to a large tribe.
To being connected, at least defining a certain, it defines the identity of the tribe, its territory, and its direction, basically. So governments are finally extension of this tribal fear, right? You could also say we have to deal with banks. Well, it's the same. When we talk about banks, we talk about the fear of scarcity. This need to accumulate always more, which is perfectly embodied by entities such as banks. So all our society is established, all the structure of our society is established on these primitive fears. So the change that we are being asked to make individually and collectively is also a social change, a structural change. This cannot be done as long as we are trapped in our fears, as long as people have to worry, or as long as we nurture the belief that the world is dangerous and needs to be dominated, or we nurture the belief that there's not enough for everyone and that competition for resources should be the driver of our society.
But now it's like people want to achieve this equality of some sort.
Yeah, I'm also not a believer in equality, so I will ask discernment.
Equal distribution, or something. I don't know. Distribution to all.
So that's communism, and that didn't work.
Well, not exactly communism, but just where everybody gets a fair chance.
Great. I would say so. Now we go into my views, but then everybody is free to disagree, and there are other. I'm very open to discuss them anyway. I believe at least if we want to move out of survival, then survival should not be conditioned to, it should be a given that we give you the ability to survive, the guarantee that you will be able to live decency no matter what is your situation and condition. So that's the only way for us to be able to move collectively out of survival. Of course, that required a better wealth repartition, because it means that, okay, even if you don't have money in your bank account, we won't let you starve outside.
But you have to do something for the community, for the tribe to receive that, right?
Great. So that's been the traditional approach. I think now it is being challenged increasingly by the automation of human activities. Now I strongly believe that we should have an incentive system that is made as such that the more you contribute, the more you're being incentivized and rewarded by society. But does that mean that if you don't contribute, then you should be marginalized, you should be left in conditions that are outside human dignity? That's something that I will challenge.
Well, if you have a physical problem or a mental problem or something and you can't actually participate,
sure,
you've got an excuse.
Indeed.
But if you're healthy and well-being, have a well-being, you should be able to contribute.
So I think every human being who's healthy mentally wants to live by contributing, because nobody wants to wake up and be purposeless. Nobody wants to wake up and be meaningless. Nobody wants to be at the fringe of society. Well, the thing is,
there seems to be, I don't know, in the West anyway, there seems to be quite a lot of people quite happy to do nothing.
How many of the job opportunities that are being offered by the West today are actually really based on contribution and meaning? I mean, most of my friends today who are having meaningless jobs, and they are pretty aware of it, that their job is not making the world a better place. It's not contributing.
Well, it's contributing to make somebody some money, I guess.
Great.
If that's something worth contributing to.
Well, I found out, for example, that in my previous corporate career, my contribution to make the world a better place was negative, because our activities were doing more harm than good in the context in which we are. So I will really, if contribution is just to create paper money to give someone who has already too much power more power, I think that's a negative contribution. In my previous corporate career, that was the case.
Yeah, well, I guess I'd imagine it's in many cases it's the case. With many people, it's the case.
Great. So
that puts food on the table. No.
Yeah, but again, so here we are totally into our current social constructs that have been shaped by our ancestors' incentive system. We are incentivized to grow more power in order to dominate, to accumulate more resources, and to fit in. Yeah. And that's exactly what's dysfunctional. So what I will recommend is for us to start to recognize that we are driven by a system and fears that are inherited from a bygone past, and that in order to change that, we first need to recognize that. So that's...
But in my case, I haven't worked for anybody. I haven't had a job. I haven't had a wage from anyone for about 30 years or more.
Mhm. But would you consider that this is the norm today?
I think a lot of people would aspire to work for themselves.
Sure. And this is part of the solution. So the first solution is to start to work for ourselves and not to work for somebody else. Or to not work for somebody else in a job that does not serve any other purpose than to make that other person more wealthier because they are driven by greed.
Well, but in my case, I've employed people over many years, and I wouldn't say I'm just employing them just to create, my greed.
So again, it's not something personal here, and I let you deal with your consciences and know by yourself what's your contribution and what is driving you. If you don't know it consciously, at least you know it deep inside yourself. The point is more to look at our collective patterns right now. I mean, I wouldn't go into to pointing
Piece by
fingers.
piece.
Yeah, I mean, we all have different
I just
stories.
imagine there's many different stories.
There's as many stories as there are people, and we are all doing our best, knowing that this is our heritage, and we can't blame our ancestors because they did their best either.
But what you were saying before about you didn't know what your position was, and you weren't helping the cause or helping the planet or whatever it was that you said. Maybe it was helping something or someone.
Oh, for sure, it was, and
So-
I will not. I mean, it was helping. Of course, it's always helping something, but again, it's like
You're supplying,
if I
supplying food to people. That's
sure. So that's what I was telling myself to feel better. But if I look at it, I mean, I was importing like luxury food to supply wealthy people with, I mean, it's okay. I mean, I wouldn't go into the good or bad. I would say that at this moment, when we are overshooting all the limits of our planet, is this really what we need? And surely, I think the response to me is no.
No. Wow. So it's everybody, I guess, has to make a decision about that. Their own decision. Because I'm quite sure people down at without naming names, but these venues around the place are very fancy and expensive and.
Yeah, and again, it's onto our individual choice. But what I want to bring here is that I don't think these individual choices are often made. They are not the result of a process of awareness. They are likely generally the result of a process. We've done it because we've always done it.
Like a corruption of some sort.
Well, no, it's just. I mean, I can't blame myself either. I mean, I've done my best. I went to school. I did my best to have a career, to show to my parents that I could be successful, to reassure myself that I'm worthy, and that's what was offered to me at the time. No, it took me a process of introspection and realization in order to come out of it, in order to realize that, okay, by doing so, I was more part of the problem than I was part of the solution. And also really questioning myself about what do I want to be part of. Yeah. So here really I want to, no matter what you do in your life, the point is not to judge yourself and to start to bring guilt, because the point is not to be guilty. It's just to be aware of the time in which we live and the changes that we are being required to make in order for us to become a sustainable species, in order for us to not sacrifice our future and the future of the next generation out of unconsciousness. And maybe this is where I wanna dive a little bit. It's the unconscious part, because this is a fundamental part of this subject. Are you okay with it? So,
I'm fine.
Okay, great. So what I want to say here is that our ancestral heritage and our survival instinct is contained in our subconscious and our conscious for the biggest part. Is what very often we call the ego. And the way I define the ego is it's the unconscious survival program that works in autopilot. So now all these hundreds of thousands of years of evolution and more, because we can take the pre-Homo sapiens evolution, there was also, all of this is stored at the cellular level in our subconscious and unconscious. And if I go, and before I go to dive inside, they shape what we call the ego. So the ego is considered, you see in many teachings, as the bad guy, right? The guy you need to get rid of. The part of yourself that is, at least I see in many today spiritual teachers are really demonizing the ego as, this part of ourselves that is really bad and terrible. So I really want to challenge that view. It's just our survival instincts, and that survival instinct protects our interest with the best of what he knows, and most or the best of our belief, or with the belief that we have, not the best necessarily, all the belief that we have. Now, what's really interesting is that most of our beliefs are not at the conscious level; they are at the subconscious and unconscious level. So, for example, it is very possible that I'm gonna speak for me, because that's one that I have found out in myself. In my corporate career, unconsciously, I was driven by the search of power. And money being power and access to resources, they are very intercombined, right? And so when I look what I wanted, somehow a part of me wanted to, unconsciously, and I didn't know that, because for me, I was the good guy and the bad guys were outside. A part of me wanted to dominate the world. Now, if I looked at that part of me, was driven by the belief that the world is dangerous and that therefore it must be dominated. That belief was not conscious. That willing to dominate was not conscious either. But that was a behavior that was resulting in me having a behavior which was very dominant, very alpha. And
is it also about like procreation?
Yeah, it's part of it, if you want. Well, although I will put procreation in the status category and the need to fit in, right? So procreation is the perpetuation of life. It's a survival instinct.
No, but by being wealthier or having fancier things, you attract a mate, a certain mate. Is that subconscious as well?
Of course. And they are all interdependent and interconnected, which is really makes the sweet part, is that the more we have power, the more we have access to resources, the more we have access to mate, to reproduce, right?
Which is a big fundamental in all this too. Right?
It's a big fundamental, right? But all of this is back to the survival instinct, the primitive survival instinct, right? Let's talk about the reproduction, because it's an important one as well. So if we look at just 10,000 years or back, there wasn't so many Homo sapiens on the surface of the globe. So we were in need to reproduce and grow in order to survive as a species. We were not in a situation of overpopulation like many people can see today. We were in a situation of underpopulation where our species was in a very vulnerable position, threatened with extinction. So it's back to, where is this instinct really well placed, or has it been unconsciously taken in a context in which it becomes counterproductive, right? If we are not enough, then reproduction is needed so that we can reach a proper number. If we are too many, then not to say it must be stopped, but it must be brought to consciousness. It cannot be driven by a non-conscious survival instinct anymore, or else it becomes dangerous.
Which apparently we're in that position now.
We are in that position now, and we are in process of realizing that. And us having this conversation is part of this process, as far as I can tell. So beliefs. So when we look at this belief, for example, the world is dangerous, which can be conscious or unconscious. In my case, it was unconscious. What I saw is that it was repressing that very fear that I had inherited, that fear of hostility. So it's very interesting because very often, so when we say, if I start to nurture the belief, unconscious or conscious or not, that the world is dangerous, very often what happens is that I am justifying that I am afraid. And that fear becomes repressed and not visible anymore. It's like, no, I'm not afraid. It's just the world is like that. It's dangerous. And if I look down into that fear, what I find is unresolved traumas. Unresolved traumas that can be collective or individual. So if we look at the past history of Homo sapiens, we can find plenty of traumatic experience at the collective level. We got war, we got genocides, we got famines, we got slavery, we got our ancestors have been amazingly creative.
Very nasty place.
Well, it's been a nasty place. It was. I mean, yeah, we were beasts trying to survive in a hostile environment, and so we've acted as such, which is very natural.
For sure.
And so, what we don't see, one of the blind spots that we have today, is these collective traumas, and this, which is very active in the collective unconscious, and impacts our fears, our belief, and therefore our social construct and our collective behavior and collective patterns. So that's actually very interesting and very game-changing.
So you were saying before about your fear, repressed fear, and trying to, that's manifesting itself in you wanting more, or being greedy, or wanting more and more in a corporate world.
Yeah, that was for me. So for me, so okay, let's get personal. I will share my personal experience on that. So I didn't want to acknowledge these fears because being fearful was being vulnerable in my belief system at the time, which I had no awareness about. So it was really happening behind the radar, behind my level of awareness. So what I was unconsciously seeking was power, right? Access to resources and validation, right? I was very primitive. And by the way, I still have to do a lot of shadow work to address these things because they are still in some parts of myself. It's really amazing how deeply rooted it is. So basically what I will do for validation, one of my, so they are really all interdependent and interconnected, but I can clearly say one of my pattern was to compulsively seduce women, to have a lot of sexual partners. That was to reassure myself that I'm still able to seduce and I'm still able to mate.
Powerful.
Power. It's linked with power. So power was given to me through my status in the corporate world, notably. So by being a senior manager, I had some kind of power over a lot of people around me. And so it's really, when I say it's really interdependent and interconnected, it was really visible because the more I had power, the more I had access to resources, the more I had, potential, the more I had status and potential abilities to seduce and to mate. So all of this was...
But if this was, say, 100 years ago, it's not a problem. Or is it?
No, I would say it probably, no, that was necessary before. Was necessary before.
So now we have to suddenly rewire the way we think to survive.
Yes, basically. So we have to rewire the way we think, and in order to rewire the way we think, we need to go dive into the parts of ourselves that are unconscious and bring them to consciousness. And we have to do that at the individual and collective level. That's the game. That's the game we are playing right now, obviously. And that's very challenging and very disturbing because we have to dive into this traumatized part of ourselves. We have to... So if I was to resume the game, healing our past traumas, individual and collective, overcoming our primitive fears, dissolving or limiting our destructive beliefs. That's the game.
And how do we go about that?
Okay, that's a very good question. So there's many ways to respond to that, but let's go step by step.
But wait a minute. One, just as an aside, does everybody have to do this? Does everybody have, for the world to survive, does everybody have to collectively do this? Or is it just some?
Well, okay, well, we don't have to do it all at the same time. All right? So if you want to be part of the pioneer, then you start to do it. And if you want to be a follower, you wait until there's a subsequent mass and that it feels more safe to do it.
Go on.
So the first, we're always going to go back. I think I said that last week. I'm going to say it again. So the first step before we can address a problem is to recognize that we have a problem. The second step is to understand the nature of the problem. Right? So right now, we haven't yet done that. Right? We are just bring it. So let's say that once you understand the problem and its nature, then you can start to take steps in order to undergo this process of transformation. Now, whether you want to be a pioneer, which means one of the individual that will make the individual change that will allow for the collective change to happen, is up to you or not. Let's say that if you don't want to be one of the pioneers to do this, then you are letting others the job of doing it, right? Which is perfectly fine, as long as you make a conscious choice and not an unconscious one, right? You may have very good reason not to undergo that process because you have other priorities that are more important, because you know that this process is going to be an investment of time and energy, right?
Yeah. It's just that I'm thinking about this, the world that we live in, and you know the systems that are already in place, and and the economy that's already in place. Does it mean a great change and quickly, or is this over 50 years or something?
That's a very good question. So first of all, I don't have a response to that, and it's up to us. I would say though that we should be driven by a sense of urgency, because as the current ways are unsustainable, we are getting nearer and nearer a breaking point that would be quite dramatic for everyone. So we don't want to go too fast because we don't want to create more chaos than is necessary, and we also don't want to panic and be on a freak out mode. But we want to take this seriously enough. How long it will take is up to each of us. Ultimately, a collective change is the sum of our individual change, and it starts within each of us. So it's back to individual responsibilities. Who do you want to be? What do you want to do? What legacy do you want to leave? What I want to say is that we are all invited to take part in this crucial moment of our human history. We are all invited to do it. After the choice we made will leave us back to our consciousness. I personally will not place any judgment. I mean, it's really back to you and your own willingness.
But how about this top 1% of where the wealth is? There's a bunch. I don't know how many. Maybe there's 100 people, 100 families that have all this wealth.
Yeah.
Then you look at someone like Bill Gates, for example, that spends most of his time trying to make life better for people around the world, and he's obviously trying to do something.
Sure.
So all these other people, they must be doing something too, right?
So great. So I mean, first it's debatable whether Bill Gates is acting for the greater good or not, and I don't want to have a point of view because I don't know him enough. I mean,
it appears that he's doing something.
He's trying to do something. No, again, what I've noticed working on the unconscious part is that nobody believes, or only psychopaths believe, that they are really evil. The evil is basically unconscious. Is that, I think I'm acting for the greater good, but what I don't see is that in the background there's my ego
Yeah, but Bill Gates has got hundreds of people working for this foundation, and they're all over the world, and they're not all evil. So the notion of someone like Bill Gates. You're not saying that.
No, I mean, first of all, I don't see. I don't know anyone who's fundamentally evil. I know people who are so broken and so driven by the unconscious that their behavior is extremely destructive, and that these people don't need to be hated or destroyed; they need to be neutralized. So I don't see evil. So when you tell me, like Bill Gates is not evil, and like this, of course they are not. And I'm pretty sure, I'm convinced that they are genuinely believing that they are acting for the greater good. Now, let me give you an example. For example, so if my unconscious belief is that humans are fundamentally evil, because that's the way I've been raised, and that's what I observe, I am going to think that putting human beings under control into system of oppression is the right thing to do, because human beings are fundamentally evil. It's not that I'm evil, it's that I am acting naturally based on my worldview, right? Today, the belief that human nature is fundamentally evil is very widespread. And that can be explained because our belief creates our reality. So, I mean, if we believe deep inside that humanity is evil, we are going to act in ways that are pretty evil against humanity, trying to do the greater good or not. So what I want to say here is, where were we going? Is that nobody is... It's not like it's easy to point fingers and to say, it's because of the 1%, or it's because of Bill Gates, or it's because of our government, or it's because of the banks. But what we have to recognize is that what we are addressing here is a problem of unconsciousness that is collective, and that is deep rooted in our inherited past, and particularly the traumatic memories, the primitive fear, and the limiting and destructive beliefs that have shaped it.
Which we're going back to the original question of whether humanity is too evil to survive all this.
Great. So, which is going back to the point that I'm making, and I think that's the point of this podcast, is that humans are not too evil. They are just too unconscious. And in order to address that, we need to make the unconscious conscious. That's a sentence of Carl Gustav Jung.
But then my point would be that these 1% or the top 20% or whatever they are, with all the wealth on the planet, does that have to be shared around or something? Or because they are captains of industry, they create jobs.
Sure. So that, so like we go into the job creation and stuff, like there's a lot of belief attached to it. So we'll challenge that, but that's not the subject. What I mean is that, they need to be part of the change, and with the current power that they have accumulated, they are surely potential drivers. They have leverage for change. No, the thing is that they might not be interested to see that change, because the current society that give them their position of power is driven by the very unconscious that we are trying to bring to the surface. So, I mean, let's just look at it like, what happens if we realize that we don't need to fear each other, and that actually world peace is a realization away? That's a big challenge for the military-industrial complex. There's a lot of wealth that is being built on it. What happens if we realize that we don't need to compulsively consume in order to feel happy and safe, because we largely have enough? And so we can start to look for contentment instead of accumulation. That will challenge the whole consumerist society.
But I'll challenge that too, that you do get some well-being out of producing something.
Of course,
positive.
Of course. And I'm not.
Could be anything.
Of course, and I'm not gonna argue with this. Of course, and I'm not going to say we need to stop to produce. We need to stop to compete. I'm saying that we need to do it in ways that are non-self-destructive, aka that they are conscious. So here again, it's not to put a label on good or bad, like it's bad to consume. No, it's good to consume, but it's bad to overconsume.
Being more careful with the environment.
Being more mindful about the fact that our planets have limits that needs to be integrated, and that as long as we are in competition for infinite growth on a consumerist materialist paradigm, this is not possible. So that we need a fundamental change in our way of interacting with the world and each other. And that fundamental change can only happen if it integrates the unconscious parts of ourselves that drive the very behavior that are unsustainable.
Well, someone like, what's his name? Tesla, from Tesla. Slip his name right now. He must be working towards in the right direction. Right?
Okay. So yes and no, because right now, for example, Tesla, what he's promoting is space conquest. We are talking about colonizing Mars, etc.
Well, I'd think more about electric vehicles.
Okay, great. So electric vehicles, but again, so here is really important to have sense making. Okay. No, but right, because this again we tend to see. So today, most people. What has been promoted in the media is that the ecological problem was about global warming, and so therefore the solution was to limit carbon emissions, and that therefore electric cars were the solution because they emit less carbon emissions. But that's a very reductive way of thinking about the problem and its solution, because here we don't integrate overconsumption of resources. We don't integrate the destruction of the ecosystems. We don't integrate many other aspects of ecological and sustainability. We also don't integrate the very behavior that are unsustainable. So we are still looking for external solutions to a problem that actually, if we look closely, is internal.
Yeah, but fossil fuels are obviously having an effect on the planet.
So I would say that this is definitely part of the solution, and I will not argue about it, but I would say that we do not have the luxury to ignore the unconscious patterns driving our most unsustainable behavior if we want to become a sustainable species.
Yeah, but that has to go right through the whole society and
sure.
People not, doing those fatal three causes for where we are now.
Yes.
You were mentioning before.
So of course it has to go through the whole society, but before it goes through the whole society, it has to start somewhere. Right?
Yeah.
So it starts with this kind of conversation where we bring awareness to another part of the problem, which has less to do with what's happening outside of us and more to do with what's happening inside of us.
And mention again what they are.
Which ones?
Those the fundamental.
The three primitive fears.
Yeah.
The fear of hostility, the fear of scarcity, and the fear of separation.
And you're saying they are the basic.
Oh yeah, sure.
How we got here.
Yeah. And they were very important, and they drive us to where we are now, which is in a position to transcend them into something else.
Yes, but it has had some good over that's the thing. These fears have brought us to where we are now.
Exactly. So it's not about the fear is good or bad. It's just about, is it in the right place?
Yeah.
So it's really, I really want to challenge, we tend to have, we've inherited this way of saying things as good or bad. I don't see anything as good or bad. It's just like, is it in the right place, in the right context, in the right time, right? So this is about stepping out of morality, which tends to look at reality as good and bad, and to enter into the realm of consciousness, which tends to see as are things expressed in the right context.
I can see this is complicated because not everyone's the same and in the same position.
Exactly. So this is why there are individual games that we are playing, and there's a collective game, and we need to make sure that we take both in consideration. So if I was to simplify, and I think I said that last week, but I mean, ultimately this is bringing us back to the essential, which is realizing that right now we had to fight over the turf to survive. Now, in order to do so, we need to learn to take care of the garden. We've changed paradigm when we enter the Anthropocene. And in order to take care of the garden, we need to dive into the unconscious patterns that perpetuate this state of fighting for survival.
Yeah.
Easier said than done,
I know.
but necessary to be done.
We could all just, have our own garden if we got the space, and just, live very simple lives. But people are quite happy having these complicated lives too.
Sure, but I mean, I'm not saying, okay, so I'm not excited by this idea, and I don't think that's progress, right? I don't think that integrating.
It's definitely not progress.
I mean, no, and I, of course, I still believe in technology, and I still believe in the expansion of humanity in the universe, and there's so much things that we can create. But the question is, do we create these things in order to enter a rivalry dynamic and to dominate others, or do we do it to enhance life and to empower others? These are two very fundamental intentions. So if we are not clear,
but there's always the two sides to everything, isn't there?
There's two sides to everything, but ultimately, I mean, what is not sustainable is not sustainable. So it ultimately self-terminates. So when this unsustainability is deeply rooted in our core, it needs to be addressed. So I fully agree there's two sides, and I don't say that, a little bit of rivalry dynamic and competition is bad. It's just, is it benefiting humanity, or is it destroying it?
So is human nature too evil and self-destructive to not self-terminate?
No, it is not. But we surely have a lot of inner work to do if we want to become a sustainable species. And we are living in times in which we are all invited to do so.
And next week, what are the roadblocks on the road to global sustainability and what it means to overcome them?
That'll be very interesting.
Well, thanks for joining the show.
Thanks for welcoming
Benjamin Casteillo.
Yep, that was.
And we'll talk to you again in 2 weeks from now.
Yo.
And everybody can listen to these talks on the podcast on the Beat website. Thanks for joining the show. We're now going back to some music. Bless you all.
Ciao, everyone.